James didn't expect freedom to feel this quiet, no alarms, no one knocking on his door. No voice telling him what to do next. Just silence. The kind that stretches so wide it almost feels like pressure. For most of his life, James lived inside structure. Not luxury. Not chaos either. Just limits. Clear lines. Rules that didn't need questioning because they were always there. Wake up at a certain time. Work certain jobs. Stay within certain expectations. Don't risk too much. Don't want too much. And definitely don't leave. But he did. At 26, with one suitcase, a used car that rattled when it idled, and just enough savings to survive a couple of months, James left his small, predictable town and drove toward a city he had only seen in pictures. He thought freedom would feel like excitement. Instead, it felt like standing in the middle of an empty room with no idea where to place the first piece of furniture. The apartment was smaller than he imagined. A studio on the third floor of a worn-out building with faded paint and a hallway that smelled like old carpet and something fried. But it had a window. And the window had sunlight. And the sunlight made it feel like possibility, at least for a few minutes each morning. The first night, he didn't unpack. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. No rules. No expectations. No one watching. That should have felt powerful. Instead, it made his chest tighten. Because when you've lived inside limits long enough, freedom doesn't feel like expansion, it feels like exposure. The next morning, James woke up without an alarm. And immediately panicked. He grabbed his phone. 8:47 a.m. Too late. Too late for what? There was no job yet. No schedule. No reason he needed to be anywhere. Still, his body reacted like he had already failed something. He sat up quickly, heart beating faster than it should. What am I supposed to do? He muttered. That question stayed in the air longer than he expected. Because for the first time in his life, no one was going to answer it for him. Finding work should have been simple. At least that's what he told himself. He had experience. Warehouse jobs. Retail shifts. Delivery driving. Nothing glamorous, but enough to survive. But the city moved differently. Applications went unanswered. Interviews felt rushed. People spoke faster, decided faster, dismissed faster. One afternoon, after his third rejection that week, James sat in his car in a grocery store parking lot, staring at the steering wheel. Back home, things were limited, but they were predictable. Here, everything was open, but nothing was guaranteed. Freedom had taken away the ceiling. But it had also taken away the safety net. He started avoiding decisions. It happened slowly. He'd wake up, scroll through job listings, feel overwhelmed by choices, then tell himself he'd apply later. Later became tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. He'd stand in the grocery store aisle, staring at 10 different options for the same thing, unable to pick one without second-guessing. What if I choose wrong? That thought followed him everywhere. Because when your life used to be decided for you, choosing feels dangerous. Like every small decision carries the weight of your entire future. One evening, James sat on the floor again, just like the first night. Still hadn't bought a proper chair. Still hadn't fully unpacked. It wasn't laziness. It was hesitation. If he unpacked, it meant he was staying. If he stayed, it meant this life was real. And if this life was real, then every success or failure would be on him. No limits to blame. No system to point at. Just him. That scared him more than anything he left behind. His phone buzzed. A message from his older cousin Marcus. You settling in or just surviving? James stared at the message for a long time. Then typed, don't know yet. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Finally, Freedom ain't easy when you've been trained to wait for instructions. James read that line 3 times. It felt accurate, uncomfortably accurate. The next day, he forced himself out. No overthinking. No waiting for the right moment. He walked into a local hardware store with a "Now Hiring" sign taped crookedly on the door. The manager didn't smile much. Didn't ask many questions either. "You worked before?" "Yeah." "You show up on time?" "Yeah." "You start Monday?" That was it. No long process. No overthinking. Just a decision. James walked out with something he hadn't felt in weeks. Momentum. Work helped. Structure returned, but this time, he chose it. That made a difference. He started waking up earlier again. Not because he had to, but because he didn't want to fall back into that drifting feeling. Still, something inside him resisted. Even with a job, he kept his life small. Work. Apartment. Cheap meals. Sleep. No exploring. No risks. No new connections. Freedom was there, but he was only using a small piece of it. Like someone who finally escaped a cage, only to sit near the open door. One Saturday, Marcus called him. "You sound tired," Marcus said. "I'm working." "That's not what I meant." James leaned against the wall, phone pressed to his ear. "I'm doing what I'm supposed to do." Marcus paused. "Are you? Or are you just rebuilding a smaller version of what you left?" That hit harder than expected. James didn't respond. Marcus continued. "You didn't come all that way just to live safe again." "I'm not playing it safe," James said defensively. "You sure? When's the last time you did something that scared you, but in a good way?" Silence. Because the truth was, he hadn't. That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that question. Not fear that traps you, but fear that grows you. He realized something uncomfortable. Back home, limits held him back. But now, he was the one creating new ones. Just smaller. Quieter. Easier to justify. The next morning, he did something different. Not big. Not dramatic. Just different. He walked into a cafe he'd passed a dozen times but never entered. Ordered something he'd never tried. Sat by the window instead of rushing out. It felt awkward. Pointless, even. But also, new. And for the first time since he arrived, freedom didn't feel like pressure. It felt like possibility. Small. But real. Later that week, he applied for a better paying position at the store. He almost didn't. Almost convinced himself he wasn't ready. Almost stayed where it was comfortable. But something inside him pushed forward anyway. Not confidence. Not certainty. Just willingness. Freedom, James realized, wasn't about suddenly becoming fearless. It was about choosing, again and again, to move forward even when you weren't sure. And that kind of freedom. It wasn't loud. It wasn't instant. It was built in quiet decisions no one else could see. But he also knew something else now. This was only the beginning. Because the deeper challenge wasn't escaping limits, it was learning how to live without them. And that part was going to test him in ways he hadn't faced yet. James didn't notice the shift at first. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden breakthrough. No moment where everything clicked into place. It was quieter than that. Subtle. Like something inside him had stopped resisting, and started paying attention. The promotion came on a Wednesday. The manager barely looked up when he said it. "You've been consistent. Show up early. Don't complain. I need someone to handle inventory. Little more responsibility. Little more pay." James nodded like it was normal. Like it didn't matter. But when he stepped outside, the air felt different. Not because of the job, because of what it represented. He had chosen something harder, and didn't back away. That was new. But growth has a strange way of exposing things you've been avoiding. With the new role came decisions. Ordering stock. Managing time. Fixing mistakes. Before, he just followed instructions. Now, he had to create them. And that triggered something old. Doubt. Heavy. Persistent. Familiar. What if I mess this up? What if they realize I don't know what I'm doing? What if I go too far and lose everything? That last one stuck the most. Because for years, his life was built around one idea: don't risk too much. Stay where it's safe. But now safety felt smaller. Almost suffocating. One night, after a long shift, James sat in his apartment with the lights off. City noise humming through the window. He thought about going back. Not physically. But mentally. Back to smaller choices. Lower expectations. Less pressure. It would be easier. No constant questioning. No fear of failing at something that actually mattered. He could shrink again. And no one would stop him. That was the scary part. Freedom didn't just give him the ability to grow, it gave him the option to hide. The next day, everything went wrong. A shipment arrived late. Numbers didn't match. The manager got frustrated. "James, I need you to be sharper than this." Not angry. Just disappointed. That somehow felt worse. James nodded. Fixed what he could. But the doubt got louder. "See? You're not ready. Should have stayed where it was simple. Now you're just exposing yourself." By the time his shift ended, his confidence was gone. He drove without thinking. Ended up parked near a quiet overlook just outside the city. He didn't even remember how he got there. Just sat behind the wheel, hands still, thoughts loud. "I can't do this," he said out loud. It felt true in that moment. Real. Heavy. But then something unexpected happened. Another thought followed. Not louder. But steadier. Or maybe, you just haven't learned how yet. James frowned. That thought didn't sound like fear. It sounded like perspective. He stayed there longer than planned. Watching the city lights flicker in the distance. And for the first time, he saw it clearly. He wasn't failing because he wasn't capable. He was struggling because he was doing something unfamiliar. There's a difference. A big one. Back home, he did something he had never done before. Instead of avoiding the discomfort, he studied it. He sat at his small kitchen counter with a notebook. Wrote down everything that went wrong. Every mistake. Every moment he hesitated. Not to criticize himself. But to understand. It felt awkward at first. Like learning a new language. But slowly, patterns started to appear. He wasn't bad at the job. He was just reacting instead of preparing. Guessing instead of learning. Avoiding instead of asking. And that realization didn't crush him. It grounded him. The next week, James showed up differently. Not perfect. But intentional. He asked questions he would have avoided before. Double-checked things instead of assuming. Stayed a little longer to understand processes instead of rushing out. The manager noticed. Didn't say much. Just nodded once. That was enough. But the real shift wasn't happening at work. It was happening inside him. Because for the first time in his life, James wasn't trying to stay within limits. He was learning how to expand without breaking himself. That's harder than it sounds. A few weeks later, Marcus visited. Walked into James's apartment, looked around. Still simple. Still minimal. But different. There was life now. A chair by the window. A small table. Groceries that weren't just survival food. "You're settling in," Marcus said. James shook his head slightly. "I'm building something." Marcus smiled. "Better." They sat by the window that evening. City lights stretching out in front of them. Marcus leaned back. "So, does it still feel scary?" James didn't answer right away. He thought about it. Really thought. "Yeah," he said finally. Marcus laughed softly. "Good." James looked at him. "Good, yeah. Means you're still moving forward." James used to think fear meant stop. Now he was starting to understand something deeper. Fear doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes it means growth. Sometimes it means you're stepping into a version of life you've never handled before. And your mind is just trying to catch up. That didn't make it easy. There were still days he doubted everything. Days he felt behind. Days he wanted to shrink back into something simpler. But now, he noticed those thoughts instead of obeying them. That was the difference. One evening, walking home from work, James passed the same cafe he had entered weeks ago. He paused. Then went inside again. This time, it didn't feel like a challenge. It felt normal. He ordered without hesitation. Sat down. Watched people move through their lives. Different paths. Different risks. Different choices. And for once, he didn't compare. Didn't question if he was doing enough. He just existed in his own direction. Freedom still wasn't loud. It wasn't some constant rush of excitement. It didn't solve all his problems. But it changed something fundamental. It gave him ownership. Over his choices. His pace. His growth. Even his mistakes. And strangely, that made life feel more stable, not less. Months passed. James saved more. Learned more. Opened up more. Not all at once. But steadily. And one day, standing in his apartment, looking around at a space that finally felt like his, he realized something simple but powerful: freedom didn't feel scary anymore. Not because it changed. But because he did. He walked to the window. Same sunlight. Same city. Different mindset. Back then, he thought freedom meant having no limits. Now he understood, freedom means choosing your limits, instead of living inside ones you didn't choose. His phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "You good?" James smiled slightly. Typed back, "Still learning. But yeah. I'm good." And this time, he actually meant it.